But you see people who want to merge, who want to lose themselves in their enemies, do not want anything black to stand up, because it would remind them of their separateness. So no matter how good a black school would be, they don't want it to exist, because they want to rid themselves of their blackness, which they think is the cause of their problem. No matter how much you talk about black economic development, they don't want that to exist, because they call that self-segregation. And they see the worst thing that could happen to them is to be separated from their white masters. And we see a people then constantly engaged in self-denial. But reality begins to creep in. Let's look at this generation after the assimilationist fantasies possessed our minds. Not that it does not still continue to possess many of our minds today. And what have we recognized as a people who tried to turn fantasy into reality? Who permitted our fantasies to blind us to reality? What have we arrived at today as a people? Have we achieved merger with our enemies? Do they not any longer see us as black people, as various types of stereotypes? Are we yet not now more segregated in the inner cities than we were before? Are we not now more segregated in our schools than we were before? Are we not now more unemployed than we were before? Are we not now populating the prisons of America much more than we were before? Are we not now much more addicted to drugs and various other injurious habits than we were before? Are we now not more subject to racial strife than we were before? Is not criminality rampant in our neighborhoods? Are not our children not learning as much as they did before? What did that fantasy gain us? What did this striving for merger with our enemies gain us? Some of us then have started to come a bit to reality. We recognize then some 40 years almost after the 1954 Supreme Court decision that the largest percentage of us are no better off and many of us are worse off than we were at that time. After a generation of assimilationist fantasies, we find ourselves as a people without an educational agenda, still stumbling around trying to find out the best methods for educating our children, still struggling with concepts of African-centered education, multicultural education, integrated education, Head Start, and all the other nefarious and multitudes of programs and projects and titles and entitlements that have only left us confused and basically ignorant and left our problems unresolved. After a generation of assimilationist fantasies, we find ourselves without a cultural agenda. Who are we? Where are we? Where are we going? Where did we come from? After a generation of assimilationist fantasies, we find ourselves without an economic agenda, suffering economically. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, because the economic situation of African people in the world today is alarming and will soon get worse. Oh yeah, there's some of you out there can point to a few Negroes who've made it up. You know, a part of fantasy is to believe in fairy tales. standard endings of fairy tales is, and they live happily ever after. So that was this great fantasy, a part of the assimilationist fantasy that said, once we integrate with white folk, and once we go to school with them, and once we break down the barriers to employment and all this other kind of stuff, we will live happily ever after. And yet, history did not justify this belief at all. As I said on many occasions, people progress in history, but they also what? Regress. All of this happens in history. People may integrate in history, but they also do what? Disintegrate in history as well. Black Americans believe in the American idea of progress, that things must necessarily get better than they were before. Who told you that lie? There is no law in the universe that promises any individual or any people that things necessarily get better than they were before. We've seen nations and peoples and civilizations do what? Rise, mature, and what? Fall. We've seen literally races and ethnic groups disappear from the face of this earth. We can witness on this very continent the near decimation of the Native American. We can look at our own history, the history of the Reconstruction era, the history of the 1870s and 1880s, when blacks could vote, when blacks were elected to Senate, when blacks were elected to Congress, when blacks were parts of state legislatures, when blacks were sheriffs, when blacks headed corporations, when blacks had strong civil rights legislation. And yet, all of this was taken from us, and it took literally 100 years for black people to get the same thing back. If the law says that progress is the only thing that happened in the world, then we should not have been struggling for voting rights in the 1960s, because we had them in the 1870s. You see? We should not have been struggling for civil rights and the other things in the 1960s and 70s. We had them in the late 1860s and 70s. So our own history refutes the idea then that people live happily ever after, and that once they achieve a particular status and position in society, they are destined to maintain this position and only to go higher. We failed to learn a lesson then, as we are failing to learn the lesson now. We failed to learn the fact that laws do not protect anyone. That laws are not sacred. That laws are merely rules laid down by people who are strong enough to enforce them. And they're laid down to maintain their interests as a people against other people. And that they will make and unmake laws when it suits their interest to do so. And yet we have a bunch of black people who sit around here thinking that because they have civil rights laws on the books, because the Supreme Court ruled in their favor at one point, because they have some other kinds of human rights organizations, that they now are protected. The law is no stronger than its enforcement. And when the enforcement of the law is left in the hands of other people, then those people, when they choose not to enforce the law, can jeopardize us as a people. Or when they choose, can reverse the law. Look at this, what is happening today with the New York Post. At one point, Murdoch was told that he has to sell the New York Post because it is against the law for a person to own two major communications media in the same market. He could not own Channel 5 and be a major person in the Fox network and own owned the New York Post simultaneously. He had to let one go, so he let the Post go. And now what do we hear? The very governor himself and other people who even made the law now saying that they will do what? Sweep the law aside. Why? Because it is in their interest to do so. Because they need that scandal sheet and that rag to continue to degrade African American people. They need it during the next election campaign because it does the dirty work of the New York media as a whole. So while the New York Times can pretend that it is above the fray and that it is objective, and while the Daily News can dance around, they will let the Post say all the dirty things that they dare not say. But they're all in cahoots against the empowerment of African people. And we have not learned the lesson yet, that the only thing that ultimately protects the people and protects the interests of the people is that they have the power to protect themselves and to defend themselves against the incursions of their enemies. They cannot protect themselves by depending upon the laws made by their enemies and laws enforced by their enemies. We did not learn that lesson during the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. And it appears that we have not learned that lesson during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And therefore, we are vulnerable to suffer the same setbacks. And as a matter of fact, we may suffer even worse setbacks.